Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. I'm Tom, and today we are going to talk about ethics of care. This is yet another ethical theory and really another ethical paradigm. And it takes certain elements of both feminist ethics and virtue ethics, and it kind of has its own um, positive view on what it is to be ethical or how we should think about ethics in general, right? So it shares drawing more it considers the relevance of one's gender identity and also social and historical context as kind of important and fundamental to one's ethical outlook, right? So that one's gender, one's position, kind of in society, and given a bunch of different facets, is shapes one's sense of moral agency. Right? That's the way they talk about the person who is, morally or immorally. Um, from virtue ethics, a more holistic approach, right? It is more about being a good person, although it's not really focused on moral character quite in the same way that Aristotle is. Um, it does kind of think about the entire person and what the right thing to do is given a particular kind of context, right? So the basic starting point for ethics of care is that central to our um, ethical outlook is care for the particular people in our lives, right? So that's what should be the central kind of thing upon which all of our kind of ethical decisions fall, right? So our obligations to the people in our lives. Your family, your friends, your coworkers, anyone that you have, a particular relationship with, your kind of obligations to them are what are central, right? Um, so again, kind of like Aristotle's view, it sounds, just kind of very open-ended, very commonsensical, but there's a lot packed in here. So, couple things to mention. One is that um, ethics of care is not relativism, right? It takes into consideration the particular situation that a person is in terms of evaluating their ethical outlook, and it rejects the idea of like a universal moral standard. But it is not just that everyone that morals just shift from person to person, and there's kind of like no right or wrong answer or anything like this. It's better labeled as particularism, meaning that it takes into consideration the particulars of a person's situation. So let me kind of explain this. So um, think about an instance where you do something like utilitarian calculus, right? And let's say it's an unfortunate time of war, and you're faced with a situation where you can sacrifice like two people in order to save like 150 people or something like this for whatever reason. Now, on the kind of utilitarian calculus, what you do is you kind of consider the happiness of everyone involved, and you think about what it would be to lose these two lives, and think about what it would be to save the other 150 lives, and then you kind of weigh that out, the pros and cons, and say, well, overall, everyone's happiness will be better if we sacrifice these two people, right? Um, Now, you might ask in that question, well, who are those people, right? That should matter, or one might think that should matter to what the right thing to do is. And so, if that person, one of the people that we're proposing to be sacrificed, is a child, does that change your mind here? If that person proposed to be sacrificed is your child or your sibling or someone like that, it seems like um, ethically, our ethical intuition is that you should not be okay with that, right? That there should be some tension there, and because of the particular person that is. And so ethics of care um, takes that into consideration, whereas utilitarianism or consequentialism doesn't, right? It's just everyone has a certain amount of kind of happiness or suffering that factors into the overall equation. Um, so, so just something to uh, frame it up. So, when it comes to ethics of care, I outline points that I see in this article that really kind of articulate what ethics of care is, right? And one of them, the first one we've already mentioned to a certain extent, which is that um, care for others, particularly the people in our that are prevalent in our lives, is kind of central to ethics of care. But one thing that this shifts is that um, um, we tend to start to focus on relationships of dependency rather than just people who are autonomous. So, um, uh, for criminal, they really think about ethical agency in terms of, someone who's a full-fledged adult making decisions. But a lot of our ethical decisions have to do with our interactions and these kinds of relationships of dependency. So kids are very ethically charged, right? If you punch your friend in the face, like, that's bad, but if you punch a kid in the face, that's really bad. Right? Children are ethically charged, and part of this might be because they're dependent upon us. We're supposed to be taking care of them, right? And the more you look at this, you think about all the people in your lives, right? Your grandparents, you have elderly people, you have people who are dependent upon you for financial reasons, or you're dependent upon others. And there's all kinds of relationships of dependency. And so, although ethics of care is like focusing on these and this idea of caring for others, it also is kind of a jab against people like Kant and Mill, because they really take as central this idea that everyone's kind of like a consenting adult in their ethical paradigm. And, I think for ethics of care, they notice that a lot of our relationships are not like that, right? A lot of our relationships are not equal, and a lot of them shouldn't be, right? I mean, a 4-year-old should not have the same say as a 25-year-old, right? Like, it's just it seems commonsensical. And so ethics of care really kind of thinks that this needs to be part of our ethical outlook. The second thing is that it values emotion, right? So Aristotle thought this as well, right? That our emotional dispositions need to be cultivated in a certain way. And that's part of it. So someone like Kant thinks, that our emotions tend to fall into the category of what he would call inclinations, right? And our emotions tend to distort our ethical outlook, so that you know um if we're too excited, if we're too angry, if we're acting out of self-interest and these, because we're sad or something like this tends to distort our clarity of reasoning. But for ethics of care, emotion is an important part to being ethical, right? That your sadness prompts you to do the right thing in lots of situations, right? Your desire to help someone else is a good emotion to have, right? Your fear can be a helpful thing when it comes to your ethical actions. So the idea is that your emotions actually ought to be integrated and are kind of like part of your ethical reasoning, right? Um, the third point, they reject the to general moral theories. So, like, the very kind of game plan of utilitarianism, of deontology, they want to reject that. And the idea is that, having these kinds of moral theories that are so general like that, for one, they're very abstracted from our actual ethical reasoning, right? And for two, that makes it the case that they're not terribly useful in genuine ethical dilemmas, right? So when you have a real kind of concrete situation, which you could do a few different things and you really don't know what to do, it's unlikely that the categorical imperative is really going to help you out that much, right? Or, utilitarian calculus. And also, I mean, how often do we really have the time or the space to do something like a thorough utilitarian calculus, right? And so, um, so this is another thing. They think that we should not try to come up with a general one size fits all rule for ethics, and that's just a bad idea. There's also a thing in my notes. I mentioned that they reject a conception between of the distinction between the public and private spheres, right? And so the way to think about this is that implicit in Kant and Mill is the idea that we have a very kind of a notion of moral agency that operates in the public sphere, right? A kind of contractual agreement among consenting adults, right? So you have a full-fledged, adult, fully rational, thinking about things and kind of weighing all the decisions, using their reason in the right sort of way, and then making ethical decisions based on that. Um, but the private sphere is tends to be a little bit different. So, for example, the relationships in the private sphere um, are oftentimes ones of dependency, right, between a mother and a child, between a person and their elderly mother or father, or something like this. You have all kinds of situations in which um, in the private sphere where your relationships are not very contractual, right? With family, with friends, this tends to be a different kind of relationship and different kinds of implicit agreements amongst yourselves, So, and then the fifth point is that it views moral agents as fundamentally interpersonal. So this is kind of a tricky idea, but the basic idea is that you cannot abstract the decision making of a person from their particularities, right? Who a person is, their gender, their race, their class, like all those things factor into a person's reasoning and factor into what a person is, right? And only concrete individuals really make ethical decisions, right? That's the idea. And that those things are not hindrances to a person's um, ethical reasoning, but they're constitutive of it, right? And it speaks to kind of like the feminist ethics aspect, right? A person's gender identity cannot be abstracted from their ethical reasoning, right? And any person that you're going to make an ethical decision about is going to be a person with a history, with a family that was raised in a particular place at a particular time, right? All these kinds of things, right? And so they want to reject ethics of care wants to reject the kind of abstract moral agent that Mill and Kant want to really use. And I think there's good reason to think that the abstract moral agent that they have in mind is really, something more along the lines of a propertied white male at that time, right? And that's part of a broader kind of feminist critique of traditional ethics. So, anyways, that's the basics of ethics of care, and those are some of the highlights. And this is part of kind of, what would you say, a critique of traditional moral theories, and it helps to kind of unearth some of the commitments of those traditional moral theories. And so that's it for today, and I'll see you next time.